Okay, well, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to, I really have to thank our technology assistant here at the University of Southern California, Jason, for being so kind to accommodate my my circumstances. He had to get up very early in the morning and get here and set everything up. And so I just want to extend my thanks to him. I also want to thank Grant Underwood and everybody there at BYU who contributed to the possibility of this conference happening. It looks really good on camera. I wish I were there. I want to start off with something that I haven't started off with in a speech in a very long time. And I'm hoping that the relevance to our topic will bear itself out. And I'm speaking here of an incident involving a figure of folklore in the Middle East by the name of Juha. Juha, if you're an Arab, he's an Arab. If you're a Persian, he's a Persian. If you're a Turk, he's a Turk. But at any rate, one day, Juha went to the mosque and he stood up at the rostrum to give a talk. And he said to the audience, do you know what I'm going to talk about? And they said, no. And so Juha said, well, if you don't know what I'm going to talk about, there's no reason for me to talk about it. And he left. The next day he came back under the same circumstances to give a talk to the mosque. And he mounted the rostrum and he said, do you know what I'm going to talk about? And this time they said, yes. And so Juha then said, well, if you know what I'm talking about, if you know what I'm going to talk about, there's no reason then for me to talk about it. And he left again. But he came back a third day and he mounted the rostrum, looked at the people and said, do you know what I'm going to talk about? And this time they figured they'd catch old Juha. And so half of the audience said yes, and the other half said no. And in that way, they were going to sort of trap Juha in his own game. Juha then paused for a moment, looked back at the audience and said, well, then let those of you who know tell those of you who don't know, and he left again. That's tempting. Now, Juha is in a sense almost sort of kind of relevant to the topic today in the following sense. Everybody assumes to know the West. When we mention the West, we assume that we know what we're talking about. We're talking about secular, liberal, post-Enlightenment, pluralistic democracies that value individual rights and freedom. That everyone assumes they know. That's sort of a given. What we presume not to know, what we don't know, or what very few of us are assumed to know, is Islam. And particularly how this foreign, sort of strange, pre-Enlightenment, pre-modern religion can acclimate itself to the West as we all know it. In some sense, the aim of this conference, and again, in some sense, might be described as being for those of us who know, that is Islam, to tell those of us who don't know, that is Americans or Americans, and then we can all just go home. It's really a matter of how we are able to bring society at large to an understanding of Islam that will then empower us to sort of get a sense of what the possibilities of Islam and Muslims fully integrating successfully in acceptable ways into American society. Now, I want to complicate this conversation a bit by challenging both the common understanding of the West and the common understanding of Islam and Muslims. I want to challenge the common understanding of the West as simply secular liberal democracies. And I want to challenge the understanding of Islam and Muslims as simply, in a sense, the result of, just the latest chapter in the story of American immigration. I want to challenge both understandings of these two constructs, because in my view, it is only on a reconfigured understanding of both the West and Islam and Muslims that we will really be able to apprehend what is actually at stake in this whole business of the relationship between Islam and Muslims and, quote unquote, the West. So now let me begin with the West. My challenge to the category or the construct of the West is actually in the way that we use the construct the West. We say the West oftentimes, when in point of fact, what we really mean is America, right? When we talk about especially Islam and its relationship to America, we often use the term the West, Islam and the West, as if the West and America were synonymous and coterminous. And what I want to do is interrogate, in fact, challenge that understanding. Because by continuing to use the West as a synonym for America, we conceal from ourselves seminal and unique features of America that fundamentally inform the question of how Islam and Muslims can or will relate to the West. And let me give you just one parenthetical example of a unique feature of America that will inform this conversation, as I hope to make clear as we proceed. America is the only major Western democracy in the world with a major contingent of native-born, in many instances, transgenerationally native-born Muslims. And I'm speaking here of the Black American contingent of the Muslim community in America. This fact, I think Black Americans make up perhaps the second largest single group of Muslims in America. And while the numbers may not be that big, this is unique among Western democracies. You don't have this in places like Europe, in England, in France, in Germany, right? In America, a major contingent of Muslims are native born, and as a people have been here for centuries, okay? I mean, we have to remind ourselves of the fact that at one point, the most famous person in the world was a Black American Muslim by the name of Muhammad Ali. The point of this will become clear as I proceed, hopefully. But one of the things that I want us to sort of acquaint ourselves with is the fact that this contingent of Muslims in America says something about the possibilities of American identity that we don't get when we just think of the West. And again, this will hopefully become clear as I proceed. Now, America and this is again persistent to my challenge of the whole construct of the West, America is not and never was intended to be a simple extension of Europe. In fact, the German scholar of American studies, Joseph Yaffe, put it this way. He said, America was conceived with the idea of establishing something fundamentally new. Specifically, America was conceived of to be the un-Europe. It was an alternative to Europe. America was to be a motley collection of human beings gathered from all over the world, brought together to form a new political community. While the nations of Europe were bound, or at least could think of themselves as being bound by a single or common biological, linguistic, cultural, religious, and even psychological history, Americans as a whole are bound by none of this. We're too diverse for that. In fact, Americans are bound as Americans by an idea, and that idea is a political community held together by mutual subscription to a constitution. That is what America was conceived of to be, and that is why it could consistently accommodate people coming from all over the world, all of whom, in theory at least, could be equally American. But again, this is a part of America that I think many of us oftentimes overlook, and I'll allude to some reasons as to why as I proceed. But the fact of the matter is that as quiet as it's kept, precisely for this reason, it has often been very difficult for Europeans to even understand America. What is this thing? Freud, for example, when Freud came to America, the early decades of the 20th century, I think it was around 1909, Freud described America as, and I quote, a mistake, a giant mistake. How can you do this? All right? Hitler, later on, would diss America as a half Judaized, half Negrified society. And for him, this won't work. All right? It's too diverse. It's too variegated. It doesn't have enough of a common link. As late as 1973, Hannah Arendt, who herself was now a European immigrant to America, in an interview, she expressed, again, this is as late as 1973, she expressed how baffling she found America, right? Again, based on the idea that somebody who looks like me, and then somebody who looks like Donald Trump, and then somebody who looks like J-Lo, right? And then somebody who looks like presidential candidate Wayne, that they could all be just American? I mean, Europeans had a hard time understanding this. I think that as Americans, we often don't realize it, but this whole hyphenated identity thing we have going on, this makes no sense to Europeans. In Europe, for example, while we have Asian American, Asian hyphen American, we have Italian hyphen American, Arab hyphen American, there are no Asian French hyphen. There are no Arab hyphen French. There are no Italian hyphen French. There are French And then dot, 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 right? I mean, you have all these throwaway categories. But again, you're talking about a people who see themselves as descending from a common background, a common blood, a common history, a common psychological sort of orientation, as it were. And this is what it means to be a nation. That's not what America is. Now, part of the challenge that America has consistently confronted, precisely in this context, is that while America is not Europe, never was intended to be Europe, or even an extension of Europe, it has struggled from the very beginning with the impulse to homogenize, to try to forge a single social identity beyond the question of everyone's belonging to a single political community. By this, I mean, we have struggled with the idea of what is going to constitute a normative social cultural presence, a normative social cultural way of being that can be identified as normatively American. And we have tried to forge a single social cultural sort of public existence for America beyond the fact that we are a single political community. This is the vision of America that is captured in the image of, quote, the melting pot. The notion that everyone is supposed to somehow dissolve into a single American social cultural identity. Again, not simply politically, but also social culturally. The problem that this presents, and I think that at the time that this particular decision was made, it was not perceived of as a problem. But the problem with this comes in with the fact that the racial identity that was looked to inform or to underwrite this authentic American identity was whiteness. American authenticity as a social cultural identity came to be identified, equated with whiteness. And so American authenticity, again, beyond the question of constituting a single political community, right? To be authentically American somehow ended up related to whiteness. And we have to remember here, and some of us may not, the first congressional hearings that were held in America over the question of naturalization for immigrants, for people who are coming to America, and everybody was coming to America, was that part of the criteria for citizenship was that these people be free white persons of good character, right? That happened in 1790. We're going to accept as citizens free white persons of good character. Now, of course, under that criterion, Blacks, Asians, Native Americans, Latinos, others, they did not qualify for citizenship. Of course, later, this would change, and all of these groups would qualify for citizenship. Blacks, for example, became eligible for citizenship in 1877, around that time. But even as these other groups qualified for and eventually became citizens, their status as Americans in terms of their everyday quotidian existence at work, at school, at the gym, what have you, their status as Americans, both in terms of how they were perceived by others and then how they perceived themselves, would be informed by a social psychology that has shaped the minds and the sensibilities of the majority, going back to 1790. In other words, we would end up with a social hierarchy that was infused with racial connotations, even as we maintained legal equality. And this produced a social reality wherein some Americans ended up being more American than others, or at least as being perceived, and perhaps even perceiving themselves as being more American than others. This exposed the American myth of e pluribus unum. I think it's still on the back of the dollar bill. E pluribus unum, meaning from the many, one. And it revealed, in the place of this American myth, the American reality of what Yale professor Matthew Fry Jacobson refers to as America's e pluribus duo, from the many, two. And the two were white and non-white. In earlier periods of American history, non-white essentially meant black. Black was the quintessential non-white category. That's changed over the years, as we'll see as I proceed. Now, I know that for some of us, maybe many of us, this manner of presenting things may strike them as a sort of a black man's history of America. But this, to my mind, is part of the problem. It's part of the tragedy. Because in point of fact, no one knows this history that I've just defined. No one knows it better and perhaps even more painfully than ethnic whites in this country. Ethnic whites who were at one time excluded from the category of whiteness and fought like hell to gain admission into it. The Irish know this very well. Read Ignatius, how the Irish became white. The Jews know it very well. Read Eric Goldstein, The Price of Whiteness. The Italians know it. Read Matthew Fry Jacobson's Whiteness of a Different Color. In fact, Arabs know it. My colleague here at the University of Southern California has a book entitled Between Arab and White, and it talks about the struggle of Arabs to gain admission into the category of whiteness as part of their attempt to get on the right side of e pluribus duo. In fact, I'll go even farther. I know I'm not there with you, I wish I were, but this conference is being held in Utah, all right? Earlier generations of people in Utah, earlier generations of Mormons know this history as well. In fact, I'm reading a fascinating book by Paul Reeve. And the title of it is Religion of a Different Color, The Mormon Struggle for Whiteness. This is America. This is a part of what it has meant to negotiate this landscape. And this is something that is not necessarily captured in this sort of vague, very, what's the word I'm looking for? It's very clean and washed over the West, where we're just talking about democracy and secularism and constitutions and liberalism. That's not what this is. And early generations of America of all ethnicities know this very well. It is contemporary generations who don't necessarily know this, and for that reason don't know what they have contributed and what they continue to contribute to it, as a result of which we still struggle with trying to get America to understand what it means for her to come back to her truest self. And that is not as a European outpost of people who all hail from a single biological, religious, cultural, or ethnic, or even psychological history. America is the place of multiple authenticities. And so part of my point is, again, that when we talk about Islam and Muslims in the West, if what we're really talking about is America, then we cannot simply limit ourselves to conversations about secularism and democracy and liberalism and all these things. E pluribus duo has to be a part of the conversation, right? In fact, I'm going to close with some comments that I think will empower us to see E pluribus duo as part of the way that even Muslims can contribute to the whole enterprise of bringing America back to herself, as opposed to this drift into this flattening out of what it means to be an American. But now let me shift very quickly to the question of Islam and Muslims, right? It's important for us to note that E pluribus duo would exert an impact not simply on the relationship between Muslims and the dominant culture in America, but on the relationship between Muslims within the Muslim community, all right? E pluribus duo would affect that as well. And that's what I want to talk about in the last 2 minutes, which I hope I'll get a little bit of slack on, that I have remaining. Now, I can't cover everybody when I speak about the Muslim community. The Muslim community is so diverse, it's unbelievable. There are white American Muslims, Native American Muslims. In fact, I got an email from a sister a little while back who said to me that she was a Korean American convert to Islam. All right, there are all kinds of people who come into the Muslim community. And of course, I can't deal with all of them in what I'm going to present. But what I'm going to try to do is base my analysis on the three main groups of Muslims in America. And this is Black Americans, Arabs, and Asian Americans. And I want to try to do this by anchoring my discussion in 3 dates that I want to use sort of as props. And I don't mean these dates to be actually representative of detailed history. But they're props that we can hang some hats on that enable us to keep up with the conversation. The 3 dates are the following: 1619, 1965, and 2001. Right? 1619 is symbolic of the arrival of Blacks in the United States of America. Now, what's important about this is that this date begins its own sort of quasi-independent historical narrative and trajectory of which Black Americans, including Black American Muslims, remain a part. Black American Muslims are a part of a historical trajectory that precedes their actual coming into Islam, right? And here we have to remember that American Blackness was made not in Africa, but in America. And this is partly what people like James Baldwin had in mind when he said that Negroes, that's the word they used back in the 60s, Negroes don't exist anywhere other than in America. In fact, Baldwin referred to Black Americans as the world's first genuine Black Westerners, all right? I'm getting a note on my screen, Jason, I'm sorry. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. All right, so Baldwin identified them as the world's first Black Westerners, all right? Now, what's really important about this, however, is that the Black presence in America, partly because it goes back to 1619, all right, establishes the fact that in America, there is the possibility of multiple authenticities, multiple American authenticities. We do not have to be a single thing in order to be authentic Americans. No one asked Black Americans here today, where are you from? No one asked Blacks that, right? And no one is likely to tell Snoop Dogg, go home, right? Black Americans are part of that American landscape that's baked in. And part of the point that I'm trying to make here is that that establishes and maintains as an immovable fact that America is not and cannot be a single authenticity, all right? Now, it is well known that there were Muslims among America's slave population, all right? But Islam among Black Americans today is not a continuation of that slave past, right? They weren't able. The brutalities of slavery wiped Islam out among the slaves. In fact, Islam among Black Americans is largely a 20th century phenomenon. And what's important to note here is that while the conduits by which or through which Black Americans were reintroduced to Islam, they remain vague. What is not vague is that for Black Americans, Islam has always been called upon to assist them and how they could come to terms with living the reality of American Blackness, all right? Now let me switch to 1965. 1965 is the year in which the National Origins Act was rescinded. The National Origins Act, which goes back to 1924, was an immigration act that ensured that America would remain overwhelmingly white and Northwest European. The National Origins Act repealed that immigration formula and opened up the gates to immigrants from other places, including the Muslim world. And that's when we begin to get large critical masses of Muslims coming to America. Now, it is not my contention that there were no Muslims from the Muslim world in America before this date. That is not my contention at all. What I'm talking about, however, is the development of the critical mass, because post-1965 thing entails two issues. One is that, as I said, we get the critical mass. You get Muslims, coming to major cities, establishing mosques, establishing Islamic centers, establishing Islamic organizations, etc. All right? And this is, in a sense, a part reflection of the fact that they came to America precisely at a time when Islamic revivalism was afoot in the Muslim world. And just think of it in these terms, and I'm almost done, I won't go too far away. The National Origins Act was promulgated in 1965. Sayyid Qutb, and I'm using Sayyid Qutb here symbolically as a symbol, as a symbol of the full arrival of Islamic revivalism in the Muslim world. He's executed in 1966. That's the period that we're dealing with. And so Muslims who come from the Muslim world at that time tended to be a lot more religiously conscious, okay? Now, having said that much, Muslims who come to America from the Muslim world are coming from societies in which race is not the salient societal fault line. That distinction belongs primarily to one, religion, and two, social economic class, all right? In coming to America, Muslim immigrants, all right, would seek instinctively to do what every other immigrant group to America would seek to do, and that is to get on the right side of E pluribus duo. Many of them even qualifying from the beginning, being legally defined as white by the American government, all right? And so the coming of the immigrants would include a positive photo taxes towards American whiteness, pursuant to getting on the same side or the right side of E pluribus duo, just like all other immigrant groups did, Irish, Italians, and others. This, however, would place them at odds with the Black American community. Whereas immigrants are getting on one side of E pluribus duo, Black American Muslims are on the other side of that E pluribus duo. And this breeds tension within the Muslim community, right? There's also a class issue. Muslims who come from the Muslim world tended to be more educated, right? They came either with degrees or got their degrees here, went home and came back, or even perhaps even stayed, okay? Now, what we have to understand, and I'm just trying to, as the young people say, keep it 100, there's an extent to which, and I lived in the Muslim world for a number of years, there's an extent to which if you are educated in the Muslim world, there's a degree to which that implies Westernization, right? Upward mobility, in a sense, is facilitated by and is measured by your facility in foreign, particularly Western languages, all right? And so you have, even in their coming, a certain predisposal to aspects of the dominant culture that put them at odds with Black American Muslims, all right? Who tended to be from the lower classes within America, all right? Now, the last thing that is implied by all this is the problem of religious authority. Muslims who come from the Muslim world are presumed to know infinitely more about Islam than Black Americans, all right? These are people who speak Arabic or some other Islamic language. They have the advantages of transgenerational socialization in the ways of Islam, and therefore transgenerational instincts about what it means to be a Muslim that they might not even be able to articulate, all right, that Black American Muslims don't have. So this empowered that community to define what it meant to be a Muslim in America, all right, and to define the agenda of American Muslims, all right? And just to make a long story short, this meant that things like issues like Palestine or Kashmir would always make it onto the agenda. Affirmative action, police brutality, maybe not. Those are not Islamically relevant issues. And so here's the tension that E pluribus duo sort of injects into the Muslim community in this way, all right? Now, switch to 2001. I'm almost done, I promise. September 11, 2001, changed, I think, in some palpable ways, the internal dynamic of the Muslim community. Even Muslim immigrants who have been legally classed as white begin to see their legal whiteness give way to a social non-whiteness. In other words, even though they were legally justified in checking the white box on this or that form, they no longer experienced being perceived as white in the culture at large. And so while they have a legal whiteness, they have a social non-whiteness, all right? Now we begin to hear immigrant Muslims talk about the racialization of Islam. This is something that you begin to hear, all right? This was not heard back in the 1980s. Nobody talked about the racialization of Islam back in the 1980s or even the 1990s, all right? But now we begin to get the racialization of Islam. Of course, this baffles Black Americans where it doesn't offend them. I mean, what are you talking about? At any rate, we even find now immigrant Muslims increasingly identifying with the category of people of color. People of color. Not white, not black, but people of color. All right? Now, I'm not sure if this represents a full or permanent switch from an identity with one side of E pluribus duo to an identity with the other side. I don't know if this is the case. But what is clear, and this is one of the impacts of 9/11, is that the Black experience has taken on more significance for immigrant Muslims than it used to by a long shot. I go back to the you didn't hear that, but a long time as a Muslim. And I can tell you, back in the 1970s, back in the 1980s, you would not have heard Martin Luther King quoted in any Friday sermon in any mosque, certainly not in any immigrant mosque. After September 11th, 2001, Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement, all of these things become germane and pertinent to the perceived plight of Muslims in America. And so 9/11, in a sense, has brought the Muslim community internally together in ways, all right, that they were not quite on the same page before, right? And this is part of, again, the dynamic of America and what E pluribus duo does, all right? Now, I want to be clear as I close now. I want to be clear. It is not my contention that pluralism or terrorism or secularism or liberalism or democracy or any of these things are not part of what must be negotiated, what Muslims must confront in negotiating their place in America. That's not my contention. In fact, I have personally written on every single last one of these topics as something that Muslims must address, all right? My argument is simply that as far as America is concerned, without E pluribus duo, we are actually not dealing with America. We are dealing with a caricature of America. And that, I think, will skew our analysis and leave us with a false sense of accomplishment and what we arrive at in terms of our conclusions. Let me conclude then with what may in some ways be taken as a controversial note. But this is a conference, and besides, I'm far away, you can't get to me anyway. In my view, more than any other group, the Black American community, by the very fact of that it cannot be alienated from America on the one hand, and it is unassimilatable in terms of a public identity. Even when Blacks walk the same, talk the same, have the same money as others, the physical semiotics, let's just call them, all right, will always mark them as another kind of American, all right? This, to me, has the effect of preserving America's ability to stay America, to preserve America's identity as America, and to prevent the Europeanization of America. And here I want to be clear. By Europeanization, I do not mean whitening. The issue is not race. I mean, well, it is, but it's not. You'll see what I mean in a minute. But I'm not referring to the whitening of America. What I'm referring to is the obliteration of the normativity of hyphenated identity for Americans. We are Arab Americans and Irish Americans and Italian Americans and Asian Americans. The Europeanization of America will wipe that out. Black Americans help to preserve America's identity as America. If, and this is a very big if, if Muslims now have found it to be the proper thing to migrate from the white side to the non-white side of e pluribus duo, then perhaps they too will come to be seen and to see themselves as actually contributing to the process of saving America from itself rather than being a threat to the republic. Thank you very much. And I guess I'm supposed to sit down now? Okay.